this afternoon. Al Santoli is the president and founder of not-for-profit Asia American Initiative, which provides strategic analysis to policymakers, as well as integrating democracy building, human rights, and community development in areas plagued by conflict and terror in Southeast Asia. He is also director and field coordinator of the successful Terrorism Deterrent Project, Development for Peace in Sulu in the autonomous Muslim region in Mindanao, Philippines. As a former senior vice president, American Foreign Policy Council, and director of the Asian Pacific Initiative, he was the founding editor of the weekly China Reform Monitor and creator of the Asia Security Monitor. Mr. Santoli was a senior advisor for national security and foreign policy in the U.S. House of Representatives. He is the author of Military Histories, his Everything We Had, an oral history of the Vietnam War, which was a New York Times bestseller, and was named by the American Library Association to its all-time best books list. His writing has appeared in Parade, Reader's Digest, The New Republic, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, The Washington Times, and many other publications. Michael Pillsbury is an independent author of books on China, including editor of Chinese Views of Future Warfare, China Debates the Future Security Environment. The former head of Pentagon Planning, Assistant Undersecretary for Policy Planning, member of the Council on Foreign Relations and International Institute for Strategic Studies, Michael has served on the faculties of UCLA, University of Southern California, Georgetown University, teaching East Asian politics. He studied at Stanford, Harvard, and Columbia Universities. And last is the fellow who wrote the introduction to this extraordinary book, Bill Gertz. Bill has been the defense and national security reporter for the Washington Times since 1985. He writes a weekly column with Rowan Scarborough, also a Washington Times defense reporter, called Inside the Ring, a chronicle about the ups and downs of the U.S. national security bureaucracy. Bill is also an analyst for Fox News Channel. He is the author of 4 books, including the national bestsellers Betrayal, How the Clinton Administration Undermined American Security, and Breakdown, How America's Intelligence Failures Led to September 11th, and his latest book, Treachery, How America's Friends and Foes Are Secretly Arming Our Enemies, which is scheduled to come out in paperback at the end of the month. He has written articles for National Review, The Weekly Standard, the Air Force Magazine. Bill has also been a media fellow at the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University. It is my pleasure to introduce first Bill Hawkins and the others in the order in which they were represented here. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, first I want to say how pleased I am to be here today and be asked to be among those who pay tribute to Constantine Menges, one of the truly great foreign policy and patriots of this city, who I worked with for many years, not as long as some others have, but we certainly had a very good time, and I learned a great deal from him. China was, of course, one of our growing concerns, and what makes China the concern is, of course, its phenomenal economic growth. In the last quarter century, we've seen China jump from economy of $147 billion, a very poor, one of the poorest places in the world, to an economy of $1.6 trillion. Still per capita poor, but in absolute terms, an incredible increase in wealth. An average growth rate of over 9% for this period. This has, of course, been largely trade-driven, with China now the third largest trading economy in the world. It has given China incredible foreign exchange reserves, over $600 billion, the largest in the world. It's also provided China, who's been running large trade surpluses, particularly with us, but increasingly with Europe, a lot of hard currency, which allows them to finance the ambitions of the regime, most of which are at odds with our interests. And this is not just low-end products that have powered Chinese growth. In fact, Michael Pillsbury has just done a great study of China's technological development and their competitiveness in high-tech industries for the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which does a lot of great work, and is a place you ought to consult for a lot of these studies on both their security and economic progress. This has given China a great deal of confidence in their position in the world. Just last week, Chinese President Hu Jintao claimed that, quote, "the Chinese people have made a major contribution to human progress by creating the splendid Chinese civilization with hard work and ingenuity. So that right after citing a list of Chinese economic statistics, their advance over the last decade. And certainly you can go beyond this. I imagine a lot of people here have been to China and probably felt, as I did, the feeling of confidence and energy that one sees in Beijing and Shanghai, the huge amount of construction, the expanding size of their cities, and their really spectacular architecture. They're really here to stay and make a statement. You also notice that many of these high-rises that are sprouting up all over China have names of foreign corporations on them, American, European, Japanese companies, which shows us that this phenomenal Chinese growth is really financed by foreign investment and transfer of technology and access to foreign markets, which is what's transferring the money to them. When I was in Shanghai and Pudong, the economic zone across the river from Shanghai, I saw their big convention center, which was one of the first places that held the Fortune Global Forum, which is an annual event of business looking at the global economy. And by chance, the forum this year was held just last Monday, in fact, in Beijing. Not in Shanghai, which is the business and commercial center of China, but in Beijing, the political center of China, which is where these the heads of these multinational corporations gathered. And if you go to their website, you'll find their statement of what this meeting was about. Quote, as the world's economic center of gravity shifts to Asia, the dynamics of the global economy are changing dramatically. Already a dominant force in trade, China will overtake the U.S. to become the world's largest economy by mid-century. And some people think maybe sooner than that. The focus of the 2005 forum will be how multinationals can tap into the enormous potential of China. Now this fits in with an issue of Fortune magazine from October, which was devoted entirely to China, the theme of which was how China, quote, is absolutely center stage for Fortune 500 executives. Not the United States, not Europe, not any of the democracies, but the dictatorship of China is center stage for business. And participation in the global forum is by invitation only and is limited to chairmen, CEOs, and presidents of major multinational corporations. It's their statement. Among the featured speakers were presidents and CEOs of General Motors, Motorola, Walmart, and Goldman Sachs, which has financed a lot of projects in China. You might recall that President Clinton's Secretary of the Treasury was Robert Rubin, who was a co-chairman of Goldman Sachs. Recently, just a few weeks ago, he told the Associated Press, quote, China is likely to be the largest economy in the world and a tough-minded geopolitical power equal to any other geopolitical power on the globe. Geopolitical, not just economic. So they can't say that they don't know what they're doing when they finance and trade with China. They just don't care. We have, since 1993, since Rubin became Secretary of Treasury, if we count from there when we really opened up more fully to China and brought them into the WTO, we've transferred something like $800 billion through our trade deficit to China. This year, we will have a trade deficit China probably over 200 billion. We had 162 billion trade deficit with them last year. This will push our transfer of hard currency to China over the last decade or so to over $1 trillion. That means we've given them, through trade, an amount of money almost equal to the size of their entire economy. That has consequences. I'm just thankful that nobody ever thought to call the Soviet Union a big emerging market. If they did, the Soviet Union might still be here. And the political and economic strategy we used to contain and eventually force Russia to essentially drop the Soviet Union and become a more normal country give up communism would not have been possible. This is something we have to concern about, because it's not necessary for China to actually equal the United States in terms of aggregate economic potential to be a threat. The Soviet Union had an economy only about 40% the size of the United States. Yet it was certainly a threat, one capable of, had it come to that, of obliterating us. Japan, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, their industrial output was only 1/10 that of the United States. But they attacked anyway because they thought we were too decadent and soft to use our economic strength, our economic advantages against them, so that they could concentrate their forces and we wouldn't. Now, as I said, I used to be an economics professor, but certainly I could never go back and teach economics the same way I did after being in Washington. I mean, Constantine went through a great deal of public service before he went into academia. I started out in academia, and I don't think that's probably not the best way to go. You get caught up too much in theory and abstraction. I was a follower of Milton Friedman's Chicago School, free market economist. Didn't go entirely over to free trade and international economics because I had read too much history to realize that would work. But even Friedman, if I can quote from a book other than the one we're pushing today, Capitalism and Freedom, which had a big influence on me as a student. But even there, Friedman said there is one and only one social responsibility of business, and that's to increase its profits as long as it stays within the rules of the game. It's the responsibility of the rest of us to establish those rules. And that's what we need to do in our trade and economic relations with China, establish some better rules. Now, we want to talk about democracy, and Constantine's objective, and we know that growing economic potential can translate into military potential, and there'll be a lot of talk, a lot of concern about that, as there should be. But Constantine's strategy is not how to fight and win a war with China. It's how to avoid a war with China, how to contain China, how to change it politically so that it becomes a country we can trust and not have to worry about a Cold War or a hot war, for that matter. So we want to promote democracy in China, and certainly democracy is the core of the Bush foreign policy. But we have a problem of democracy here at home. We have a democracy here, but how well is it working? My experience on the Hill corresponds with a quote from Constantine's book. It's right here. The connection between the Chinese communist regime and private business is consistent with Marxist-Leninist Maoism, which assumes that all private businessmen are self-interested and self-seeking, and that they do not consider or care about the broader national or geopolitical consequences of their actions. It is also consistent with democratic political theory and practice, which holds that it is proper for private interest groups to seek government policies that help their immediate interests. In this tradition, it is up to government officials, not businessmen, to decide what is in the broader national interest of the United States. Now, that corresponds also with Friedman's proviso, but it's hard to do because in our democratic system, business lobbies very heavily to get government officials to do what they want to do and not pursue their real duty, which is to safeguard the national interest of the United States. James Sasser, who's former ambassador to China during the Clinton administration, recently told Bloomberg News, the Chinese really don't do any lobbying in the United States. The heavy lifting is done by the American business community in their behalf. Now, the Chamber of Commerce, our sort of our friendly rivals across the block from the U.S. Business Industry Council, even had a program for a while that said that sent the Chinese ambassador around the United States to give lectures and called it a national conversation with the Chinese ambassador. And it was to give China a forum to local business leaders, China's view of the world. Supposed to be about how to, business opportunities in China. But the Chinese ambassador, at least from the news reports of what he was talking about, he talked about Taiwan, he talked about why we shouldn't have a missile defense system, about why the Falun Gong should be eliminated. Talked a lot of policy issues, not just about economics. And one of our largest business groups was sponsoring that. When I was over in China last fall, I went to the Zhuhai International Air Show. And one of the things that struck me there was a display by Boeing. Had a large mural up at its booth, and there were a lot of booths from a lot of companies and countries on what they were trying to sell China. But that on how much they were transferring technology to China, how many of their engineers they were training, how much work they were outsourcing to China. But there's also, the mural also claimed, quote, Boeing leadership in the U.S. business community and hard work with the U.S. Congress resulted in granting permanent normal trade relations with China. They were taking credit for a major policy change in Washington that benefited Beijing. And I remember that fight. I was on Capitol Hill at the time. And I remember a Republican conference meeting where they were discussing that among other issues. But that was the main issue because there was a lot of resistance among the Republican side of the aisle because of national security concerns. But all up and down the hallway leading to that meeting were lobbyists, shoulder to shoulder, all up and down the hall, both sides, as many as you could wedge into the space. And they're all lobbying, you got to have normal trade relations with China, you got to have trade with China, got to have trade with China. Where was anybody in that hallway lobbying for American security interests? They weren't there. They're not, the money for the lobbying goes for special interests, self-interested, short-term gain. One of the things I worked with Constantine on Capitol Hill was a lunch program we had where we brought in people and also brought in national security, foreign policy staff people from around the Hill to get together and talk about these things because you need an offset. You need people who will talk and be concerned and promote ideas of the national interest to overcome this huge lobbying effort for the special interests. And we have to do that if we're going to implement one of Constantine's solutions here in the economic goal. I cited the normal trade relations case, not just because it's a sort of a disgraceful example of how democracy really works on the ground here, but because it runs counter to common sense. Normal trade relations, or whatever everybody else calls most favored nation status, is to treat everybody the same. All countries, all governments be treated the same, regardless of what they're doing, what kind of government they are, what their ambitions are, what their interests are. It's a business model which holds that we don't care who's in power or what they want to do. As long as they pay their bills, we're happy. How much blood we have to launder off the money, it's another matter, but that's all we care about. But you can't run foreign policy that way. You have to do, as Constantine argues, we have to treat our friends and our allies better than our rivals. We have to end the trade deficit with China, partially to increase our own economy and stop the hemorrhaging of industrial capability and jobs from our huge trade deficit, and to also save the dollar. The trade deficit has gotten so large, $617 billion overall last year, be over 700 this year. It's no longer just a question of which industry here or there is getting hurt. It's a systemic problem. It threatens the economy as a whole and our finances. The dollar is a great strategic asset for this country, having the dollar as the world's reserve currency. We can't let that be destroyed by inattention to what is happening in trade. But the other part of this, and a good part of what Constantine wants to do with our trade, is reorient it towards our friends and allies. The mutual gains from trade should be shared among people with compatible goals, compatible values, to build alliances. And if we want to help countries develop, underdeveloped countries, instead of China, there are a lot of other more worthy places to trade with. My favorite is also a place where Al has done a lot of work. The Philippines is a place. We have a long association with them. We have, because they were a former colony, we have an obligation to them, I think, as well. We should orient our trade in ways that are mutually beneficial among democratic and other allies who are in line with our policies. Now, to do that, we have to wake up, of course, those in government to think, to evaluate that way, and in line with the Friedman statement, the rest of us outside of government have to support them when they do that. And I think to build this kind of coalition, I think the more Constantine's book is circulated and read and quoted and thought about, the closer we'll come to that goal. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today. I'm Al Santoli, and Constantine was a very, very dear friend. And when I first came to Washington seriously to be involved in policy after a number of years as a journalist, which I considered following issues and trying to highlight issues of the moment, one of my greatest mentors in terms of looking at things big picture and seeing interconnectivity and understanding the connection between history and current events and integrating culture into all of it when you're talking about foreign policy and not just national security but international security was Constantine Menges. And the fact that four of us have to be here today representing, his great, last opus is a statement in itself about, what a loss he's been to the policy and the strategic thinking community. The key element, I think, with looking at the situation of the world we're in today, in this kind of cusp of history between the 20th and 21st century, really has to do with interconnectivity. For the first time, and I think one of the areas that China the Gathering Threat goes into, is that we are now seeing emerging for the first time in a couple of centuries a potential superpower, economic, political, and military, that has a sense of history and sees things in a very broad global picture, not just in terms of the Ming Dynasty of being the center of Asia, but now within this interconnected world, seeing the world as a very large scope. And for those of us that read and understand Chinese military strategic thinking, one of the key areas that they've talked about is looking at not like the mistake that they learned a lot from the mistakes that the Soviet Union made, and they learned a lot about the mistakes that we're making today. They don't have to match us strength for strength. That was the mistake that the Russians made. But looking at areas where we're vulnerable on a global level, looking in areas in terms of what the 21st century in terms of warfighting is going to mean, which is all dual use. There is no such thing anymore as specific economic, non-military types of issues, areas, or technologies. Communications, and that includes, global marketing and banking, the very essence of what we need for our comforts and our pleasure in terms of international communication is all subject to use as a military option. Electronic warfare, communications warfare, subverting of currencies. I mean, one of the great heroes right now that the Chinese strategic planners look at is George Soros, in the way that Soros, as one man with one company, took down entire countries' economies by integrating and basically undercutting currency. And we're looking today at a situation with the Chinese currency and the way that they are currently, have bought up a lot of our international debt, that basically we become not a superpower, but we become a vassal state, gradually, step by step. And this is something that if you go back into looking at, centuries when China was strong, they have not forgotten those lessons of what it takes to control without having to use force. But just in case you have to use force, they've been integrating the best of the Russian scientists. I think one thing people forget is that when the Berlin Wall came down and we thought that we had, ended tyranny and this would be, an American century, that there were a lot of loose ends. And those loose ends included some very skilled people in technology, that was defense technologies, that very much felt that we were target number one, who had no place to go. Many of them wound up either in China or they wound up in Iran. And one of the areas that Constantine had continually talked about was the need for the kind of constructive engagement with those people in not just Latin America, but the former Soviet Union, in the Middle East, in places like Iran, and especially in China herself, which is not just one massive kingdom, but it's many countries in one. And there are many good people throughout China. China should not be considered an enemy, and the Chinese people should not be considered enemies. The problem is that you've got a military-industrial complex that's supporting a very small percentage of people that have power as the Communist Party that are the problem. How did Constantine understand this? One thing that's not spoken in his book is the fact that he himself and his family were refugees from Nazi Germany, where his dad was an anti-Third Reich intellectual. So from his very core, he understood that a small group of people can take a great country and do terrible things. If countries outside, if you look at the 1930s, 1920s, well, more into the 30s, whereas the international economy had collapsed, our best and brightest of our bankers, our economists, our corporate tycoons, and many of our politicians supported the Third Reich as the engine that would drive the international economy, because the Germans could do it better than most of the rest of Europe, and maybe even in some ways better than us at that time, as America was an emerging economic and political power. We face that same problem today. If you look at the relations between the former Soviet Union, particularly the Russians, and China, most people look at it in terms of what's happening today. You have to take it back to while Mikhail Gorbachev was still in charge in Russia, going back to about 1988-89, as the Soviet Union was collapsing. That is when, I won't say it's out of desperation, but it was strategic thinking. The relationships started to be made. He announced, and then Yeltsin completed, a Russian pullout from Mongolia. That was a big issue, because when again, most people forget that in the 1960s and in the 70s, what broke the relationship, permanently broke it. I don't think that Stalin and Mao ever really trusted each other. If you look at old newsreels at summits that Mao and Stalin had, it was like two gangster chiefs, without bodyguards, and the looks on their faces, and they would look at each other from the sides of their eyes. They wouldn't look at each other straight on, because they knew that they were competing for power of who would control the Third World. At the time, their focus was the Third World. The difference today is we're talking about the developed world, not just the Third World. The Third World is still needed for the resources, but right now it's a competition for capital. The Russians felt they could do it with energy, with their oil, that they would revitalize and control even though they didn't have Central Asia anymore, but they would control that oil. They would have strategic partnerships with countries in the Middle East, and even still, it's Yevgeny Primakov doctrine. Primakov is back. You see him again emerging as once again. The Putin and the Leningrad boys that took a leap over Primakov's people, because their strategy was disruption. because Russia was never, the Soviet Union was never strong enough economically, and they never had a business sector the way that the Chinese do that could compete with the West. So in effect, what's happening now, besides all of the military technologies that are being transferred from Russia to China over the past decade or decade and a half, is right now there's a convergence between the Primakov doctrine of disruption, because Primakov's theory, and I talked to people that trained under him, it was always keep the United States off balance, let them overextend, let them over, they can't, you know, they can't take crisis, they can't take casualties. Keep the Middle East especially, because he was a Middle East specialist, keep it disruptive. Mess with the oil supplies, and that's the way they'll be taken down. Now, the Russians made a mistake in getting involved in Afghanistan, because if you remember correctly, during the Jimmy Carter period, they had the edge. After Vietnam, the Russians had the edge. They were doing great. And also, the Chinese began realizing that and then sided with us. Not really sided with us, but saw us as an ally of convenience. And I would have to say this, anybody who has read any of the great Chinese novels, especially the novels about kingdoms and wars, like The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, knows that in the way that China conducts strategic alliances, it is not based on any kind of emotional loyalty. It's based on alliances of convenience. And what really drives things forward is revenge. And it's revenge not just for the current generation, but for past generations. So we're entering a period right now where we have the Russians who also seek revenge because they have not given up their desires to reclaim empire. And at the same time, they owe us one. During the mid-90s, when the Russians were transferring a lot of very, very serious technology to China, including things such as the Su-27s and Su-30 supersonic, jet fighter bombers that can refuel fuel in flight, which could give them control of all of Asia and the waters around Asia. When the Russians were transferring the plans and designs, not only the actual submarines, but more importantly, the plans and designs by which China could build its own submarine fleet and re-engineer and soup it up a bit with the technologies that they were either getting or stealing from us. And as people from our corporate sector was enabling them to perfect their rocket launching system and also learn about MIRVing with satellites. Well, that same MIRVing you can launch multi-nuclear warheads with. And as they were stealing things from our laboratories, such as the mini-nuke technology that they could put on their submarines, well, they can hit just about all of the United States now. They can hit it from their water, and they can get pretty darn close with quiet submarine technology they got from the Russians. But during that time period, when I was working in the Congress, one of Putin's Russian KGB guys came to our office, and he was assigned basically to, attend political conventions and really start to get more of a feel for, how America politically was going to be changing as the Clinton administration was going to be ending and the Bush administration was going to come in. And I said to him, "What the heck are you guys doing? They owe you more than they owe us. You're creating a nightmare for yourself with all of these weapons technologies that you're selling them." He said, I know, we're riding a tiger." That was the expression, "we're riding a tiger." And he didn't put it in terms of what you'll see in a lot of conventional analysis, which is, well, this was needed because the only way that the Russians' arm industry was able to stay alive was by selling billions of dollars worth of things to China. He put it in these terms, and I think this is the emotion that drives it. He said, "I was on those airplanes with Ron Brown and your businessmen, and I saw them making the deals with the tycoons that enslaved our people. I saw you. We reached out to you as friends, and you tried to take us down even further. You tried to rub our noses in it. So yeah, we're doing this with China." And that, I think, even more than just making money to keep their nuclear industry, but also their large military industrial industry going, has driven this. We've made a lot of mistakes ourselves, which we don't confess to because of our overconfidence. In the same way that we're taking things for granted in the relationships right now that the Russians and the Chinese have in Latin America. And this is also an area, an integration area that, well, let this get fixed. Bill, do you want to turn this thing off? But anyway, it's an area that Constantine was very concerned about, because in the relationship now with Cuba and Venezuela especially, there was an issue of the Russians selling weapons to Venezuela that the U.S. was protesting, U.S. government was protesting, I believe, last month. This is not in competition with China. China has had, for the first time in our hemisphere, outside of Cuba, foreign military trainers, both Army as well as Air Force, in Venezuela, partially training the Venezuelan Air Force on some airplanes that were sold, but also when the coup, or not the coup, but the massive demonstrations that almost brought Chavez down a few years ago took place, U.S. Special Forces were pulled out. Within 1 month, Chinese Special Forces were in, doing the same thing our guys were doing, and fluent Spanish speakers. To my knowledge, that is the first time in this hemisphere, outside of the Russians in Cuba, that we've had something like that happen, where a potentially adversarial power has moved in military trainers into the American hemisphere and in a place that we are absolutely dependent upon for oil. At the same time, when you're talking about asymmetrical warfare and the use of information technology, electronic warfare, disruption of our command and control systems, the Chinese have moved in big time into Cuba. They've opened up, they haven't just moved into Russia's facilities, the major facilities that the Russians have had, but they've opened up their own facilities, new facilities. And our own Federal Communications Agency has in the past found experiments happening out of those sites where we've had our air traffic control disrupted out of Cuba, basically from those Chinese sites. So they're practicing, they're getting ready in case anything should happen in the future where they can hit us where we're most vulnerable, which is our communications. This is also why I think it's a mistake in the way right now that defense planning is trying to consolidate a lot of our critical air and naval stations to put a lot of assets in one or two places, saying the Atlantic coast is no longer a problem from the West Coast. The alliance between Russia and China and activities out of Cuba can really hurt us. And we should be diversifying where we have our military assets, because they are vulnerable, comprehensively vulnerable. And it's a big mistake to take that relationship, strategic partnership, which when we talk about strategic partnership, it's based mostly upon, you know, well, we're going to make money together, I think, by and by. Even when you talk about, when we've said about the Chinese or the Russians, it's a strategic partnership. No, it's not quite that. They don't really see us as friends. It's more about who's going to take advantage of who. It's the same thing with the Russians and Chinese, but it really is a strategic partnership against us, and we cannot take that lightly. Whether it's something that's happening in Central Asia, whether it's happening, you know, just off our own shores in Cuba, or it's happening in a place that we rely upon tremendously for energy, like Venezuela, and what's happening with Iran right now, where there was a multipolar agreement, meaning that the United States should not be the world's only superpower. A lot of people might not disagree with that for a lot of reasons. But when you have countries with power who are adversarial, that are forming a multipolar relationship, and when you're talking about key energy supplies, which are going to drive the future, and much like what caused war in the Pacific in the 1940s, could also drive a war in not just the Pacific, but across Asia and Central Asia in the 21st century. It's a very serious issue that we should not hope will go away, because it's not going to go away. And the other factor that I know that Mike Pillsbury is going to get into is the issue of what to do and how to do it. It is absolutely essential that Taiwan survive, because Taiwan is the first ethnic Chinese state that has ever had some sense of electoral democracy. If we abandon Taiwan, if the world abandons Taiwan, what kind of message does that send to the people of China? In around the year 2000, 2001, the Russians and Chinese under Putin made an agreement that if China is attacked, if China gets into a war, that the Russians will support them. This did not get a lot of play in the American press. It was reported both in Russia and China. That's about Taiwan, in part. It's about the South China Sea, and it's about battles over who is going to control the 21st century, and whose ideas will control the 21st century. Will it be ideas that, even though we're not perfect and we make a lot of mistakes, but we still advocate liberal democracy? Or will it be those who increasingly in Russia and in mainland China, who have the power right now, advocate suppression of any kind of human freedom? And this is, I think, going to be, it's about vision, and it's about not seeing things in a stovepipe manner where you separate every quadrant of the world and say, well, that's not my area. That's not the way that Russia and China sees us. And the way that we're being targeted right now, we being not just the United States, but the free people of the world, is in a way where we're being encircled. We're being encircled in these little strategic places that most people wouldn't think meant much of anything. And they don't see a connection. But there is a connection. And if you look at Constantine's books, he draws that very, very succinctly. That's what's happening in places where you might not, if you don't understand the way the strategic game is played, by masters of strategy because of their history and their culture, such as China and to a lesser extent Russia. Americans aren't very good at this. We're a young country. We're not a coherent culture. And we were not created to be an empire that is in contradiction of who we are and our ideas, because America is an idea. We're not a tribe, we're an idea. And when you're going against people that have a strong sense of destiny that's more rooted in some ways in being a coherent culture or tribe, and have a strong sense with their ancestors, and where you have a strong sense rooted in revenge, especially now where you have great strides being made, a great leap forward being made in understanding, comprehending, and integrating technologies, especially technologies that we take for granted in terms of their military application. We have to start playing catch-up real quick. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Mike Pillsbury, and before Constantine Menges died, we tried to figure out when we'd first met. We both had Columbia University PhDs, Nancy, and he's older than me, but we decided it wasn't Columbia, it wasn't in our academic phase, it was in the corridors of the CIA. And the reason I had a hard time remembering when I first met Constantine Menges has to do with this book and what this book is really about, which I want to spend a few minutes on. When I would meet Constantine, either as I mentioned in CIA or in the calls of the Pentagon or where Norm Bailey used to work in the NSC staff offices, I remember very vividly a certain mannerism he had. He always had his jacket buttoned like this, and he would sort of catch you by the sleeve and say, have you, and then he would say something that just happened that morning. Have you seen this latest top secret report? Something like that. And you couldn't ignore it. You had to stop and pay, okay, what? No, I didn't see that. What was it? And then he would say, well, something just happened, and it's terribly important. And it would shake you out of your reverie or whatever else you were working on to pay attention to Constantine Menges, which is how he got his nickname. He was very fond of his nickname himself. He used to refer to himself as Constant Menace. That he always had some, but then the second part of his mannerism was he would reach into his pocket and he'd pull something out. And those of you who knew him well remember this gesture. He always had something in his pocket. And it was linked to the menace or the top secret cable that had come in that morning. In other words, he didn't just diagnose the problem. He already had somehow that morning typed up a potential solution. And sometimes it would be something like, you need to get the Secretary of Defense to sign this letter. It's a letter to the President. And I would say, well, you work for the President. Why did? He said, well, if the Secretary of Defense weighs in, that will help me make my case. So he'd already thought through the idea of coalition building inside the bureaucracy. And frankly, this book is about how to put together a coalition to deal better with China. In this book, Constantine, who was not by any means a China expert, as he'd be the first to say, he's gone through all the material and all the evidence. I think it took him about 10 years to do this, if I'm guessing right. And instead of saying we don't know this or we don't know that or gee, you know, many things could happen with China. There are 5 scenarios. This is what the regular China experts do. They say, well, there's 5 scenarios. China could turn out this way or maybe that way. And that what that induces in the audience, including senior administration officials, is complacency, confusion, a kind of sense of paralysis. Well, gee, if you China experts don't know what to do, how can I do anything? A president might honestly say. Constantine Menges doesn't do that. In 500 pages, he goes through and he settles on one course that's going to happen. And it's quite a persuasive case. It's the chapter in here on the stealthy strategy of China. And without firing a shot in his 25-year projection, Constantine tells us how the Chinese could do what they say they want to do. And I'm quite flattered he uses a couple of my books to pull out examples of things the Chinese leadership have said. But he doesn't stop there. He doesn't just pull out, oh, this just happened. China has this scenario for the next 20 years. He's got an answer. And this, to me, is the brilliant final 2 chapters of the book. And he puts forward 2 plans. And we'll all know in the coming 5 to 10 years whether Constantine Menges' plan is implemented or not, because it's very clear. And there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek in here. He says, well, Senator Joe Lieberman and Senator Jesse Helms proposed a program for $100 million to bring democracy to Cuba. And then he says, well, here's Cuba's population like this. Here's China's population. How much would it take for China? And how important would it be compared to democracy in China compared to democracy in Cuba? And much of the book is about what happens if there's no democracy in China, but they continue this colossal pace of 9 or 10% a year GNP growth. And his answer is, trimming the numbers, he says, let's propose $500 million a year should be appropriated by the Congress to establish a China democracy project. And much of the last 30 pages of the book is the details of how this China democracy project would work. Now, I don't think he really means 500 million, but he means a lot of money. And he means that current policy, current institutions, including, by the way, the government of Taiwan. The government of Taiwan is not directly criticized, but it's apparent Taiwan does almost nothing to bring about democracy in mainland China. The president of Taiwan seems to believe that he's not really part of mainland China, so why should he be busy with Taiwan's resources trying to bring democracy to the mainland? Well, the Russians are not, the Indians are not. Who really has the job of bringing democracy to China is what Constantine raises as a question. And that's why he proposes this $500 million institution. Then he describes what it would have to do. And here's the big surprise. As I mentioned, he's a coalition builder. He's a coalition builder. He wants to find many different groups. Every time he mentions a Republican senator in here, by the way, he links it with a Democratic senator or congressman. This is a sort of bipartisan, non-partisan approach to China policy. He mentions trade, he mentions weapons. The term gathering threat is a very vague and general term he uses to put forward the need for his program. And the program says our basic allies are inside the Chinese Communist Party. Now, if you're a down-home, old-fashioned, traditional conservative in America, you know you have to hate communist parties. They're bad. Communism is bad. That's sort of the heart of the conservative National Review argument over many decades. Here's Constantine Menges, our hero, saying our natural allies are inside the Chinese Communist Party. And frankly, this covers about 30 pages. It's a brilliant section. How to bring about reform from within the Chinese Communist Party. His second group of allies, very interesting, are those Chinese who live overseas in democracies, in the US, in Europe, in Southeast Asia. He says, how can we mobilize them to link up with reformers inside China in the Communist Party? Very interesting set of suggestions he makes. Then third, he says, this is not happening now. And throughout the book, Constantine reserves really his his venom, if I can use that word. He uses his venom for people who believe in something that he has 2 words to describe. It's not every page, but it's at least every few pages. Any of you know what these two words are? It's the sinners that he's attacking. The sinners are those who believe in something he calls economic determinism. Economic determinism. That is, if we trade with China, if we invest, if they become a very powerful country, if they surpass our own economy, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Why? Because when you have all these entrepreneurs and all these rich people, of course they're going to demand democracy. And then there'll be a Hollywood-style happy ending to China. Constantine Menges says no. No. He has a very powerful sentence where he says this has never happened. This has never happened in history. The struggle for democracy is bloody. It's serious. There's conflict. People oppose it. There's going to have to be a struggle. He hopes political and peaceful, but still a struggle. So he reserves his venom for the economic determinists. And he has allies in this. Jimmy Carter, of all people. Jimmy Carter has a program to help the village elections in China become more true elections. So yes, here we have a traditional national security conservative, Constantine Menges, linking up with the Chinese Communist Party, Jimmy Carter, Chinese exiles. I mentioned the names of some of the congressmen and senators. Dave McCurdy comes in for a lot of praise in here because of some things he's done. Joe Lieberman. So this is not your standard book on the China threat, that they have so many missiles, we have to have a missile defense system. He's for missile defense, but it's not the answer to the gathering threat of China. The answer is this program that of all things is very close, and Constantine died so he couldn't hear it, very close to George Bush's address on the need to bring democracy to the world. And I just want to close on one thought, and I think if Constantine were here, he'd laugh. I said, you know, one of the funniest things I've seen this year on China policy, the speaker didn't say China, but it applies to China. And it applies to why Constantine proposes this $500 million project with exiles and working with the Chinese Communist Party reformers. It was Laura Bush, when she was addressing the White House Correspondents Association, and she turned over to tease her husband and said, well, Mr. Excitement here, always in bed by 9 p.m. Then she said, if I remember correctly, I've told George, if he wants to end tyranny in the world, he's going to have to go to bed a little later. That's what Constantine is telling us here. If we want to end the rise of a communist government that's on track to surpass us economically in every possible way over the next 2 or 3 decades, we've got to stay up a little bit later to work on it. That's the heart of the book, and it's really quite a brilliant argument. I won't say you should skip the first 500 pages, the history, the diagnosis, the part where he would bring something out, but if you just want to read something late at night when you're thinking about tyranny, read the last chapter. It's quite magnificent. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'd like to finish up our panel here and talking about China, the gathering threat, by looking at some of the national security and military and intelligence issues related to the People's Republic of China. I think, you know, we all here talked about gaining certain things from Constantine's book, and for me, I think one of the most important parts of understanding Constantine and his book was the fact that he was a visionary, and he understood strategy and he understood policy, but he was also an activist, and it's a very rare combination to find both that intellectual foundation as well as the concrete policy prescriptions, and that's what really made him successful. And I think that, as Mike just mentioned, why it's so important. He talked about 3 basic premises to his worldview, and one was political and communication action to tell the truth, and the second was containing communist regimes and rogue states, and third, restoring pro-Western forces through supporting indigenous forces. Well, as a newspaper reporter, it's this first part, telling the truth, that's my job, and that's what I feel is very important to do. And earlier speakers talked about how important it is to be very clear about what's out there, and I think that is really lacking in the case of China. We really don't have a good understanding of what the Chinese are up to, what their long-range goals are, and how they're going about implementing those goals. A couple of quick statements, I think, which help to understand that. One is the statement by Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader, who said, "Bide our time, build our capabilities." And this gives you a sense of where China is going, especially in the national security area. And the second is the ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, who said, the acme of skill is defeating your enemy without firing a shot. If you understand those two concepts, and you can understand what's going on today with the Chinese military buildup and, to a lesser extent, the intelligence threat from China. So I'd like to just briefly hit on those topics and tell you what's going on. From a hardware perspective, the China military buildup today is going much faster than earlier estimates believed. And this is, you only have to look at certain numbers to know what's going on. Many years ago, and I've been working on this for a long time, many years ago I did an article for the Times on the Chinese military and what was going on, and I got some briefings at the Pentagon, and at the middle of one of the briefings a colonel came in and said, "The general would like to see you." And I can't identify him because it was on background, but he had more than one star, and he told me that China was not a threat. And I was pretty astounded because you know, I expect that maybe from the foreign policy community or even the civilian intelligence community, but to hear a senior military intelligence official telling me that China's not a threat really didn't compute. And the reason it didn't compute is because militaries have to deal with capabilities. And in the case of China, if they have nuclear missiles that we know they do that can hit the United States, how could somebody in that position claim that China was not a threat? Well, what I understood from that was that China had been so successful in its strategy of deception. On top of that, the United States has also, and especially in the academic community, adopted a policy of self-delusion. So between the Chinese seeking to play down the threat that they pose and building their capabilities, and the U.S. Kind of deluding itself, even during the Clinton administration, they called it the self-fulfilling prophecy. They said that if you treat China as a threat, it will become a threat. In fact, even as much as 5 years ago, there were China experts who ridiculed the notion of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan as the million-man swim. And this fit in with the theory that to play down the Chinese military buildup. I can tell you that in talking to Pentagon officials today, I asked someone about that. What about the million-man swim? And a senior official said to me, he said, "We left that behind a few years ago, and we no longer believe that at all." And the reason they don't believe that is because of China's capabilities. Let's just take in the area of naval forces. Since 2002, China has built and deployed over 20 new submarines. In addition, they've also built and deployed over 20 new amphibious lift ships. You know, in the intelligence world, those are pretty much considered indicators. If you're building up the capability to move forces and to operate stealthily under the water, that kind of gives you a sense of where they're going. And this was literally within the past 3 years. Previous Chinese military developments often took as much as a decade to do even a new class. Here, just last year, I was able to reveal in the Times that the Chinese had built the hull for an entire new class of attack submarine called the Yuan class. The new submarine took U.S. intelligence agencies by surprise. It was photographed, it was shown on the internet, and lo and behold, the Chinese had been able to develop an entire new class of attack submarine. And that, of course, doesn't count the purchases that they've made from Russia, primarily, which included advanced aircraft and missiles, as well as advanced guided missile destroyers, the two Sovramenis, as well as the new Kilo-class submarines that the Chinese have obtained. Just recently, a Russian export official disclosed that Russia had already sent some of the first SSN-27 missiles. This is a naval cruise missile, which fits with China's anti-aircraft carrier strategy.